Let's get started on Module 4, vCenter Server, Part 1. In this module, we will talk about the vCenter architecture, and we will install vCenter Server. Then we will install the vCenter Server appliance, and then install the vSphere web client. Then we will use the vSphere web client to manage vCenter Server inventory. Let's start out with vCenter Server architecture. Let's talk about connecting to ESXi hosts one at a time. You can use the vSphere web client to connect to ESXi hosts one at a time. And if you only have one ESXi host, it's not a problem. But if you have a large data center and a large number of ESXi hosts, then connecting to and logging into each one at a time is very time consuming and labor intensive. The statement of the problem is that logging on to ESXi hosts one at a time is time consuming and labor intensive, especially if you have a large number of ESXi hosts. So the solution is to use vCenter Server. vCenter Server provides a centralized platform for managing your VMware vSphere environments. vCenter Server allows you to connect to and to configure many ESXi hosts. So here is you, the network administrator, and here are all of the ESXi hosts. You connect to vCenter Server, and vCenter Server can allow you to manage all of those ESXi hosts. If we look at the vSphere management platform, we see that vCenter Server allows us to manage a large number of virtual machines running on multiple ESXi hosts, which are connected to multiple data stores. The vCenter Server is very similar to Active Directory. Active Directory by Microsoft allows you to centrally configure multiple Windows servers from one location. Similarly, vCenter Server allows you to centrally configure multiple ESXi hosts and virtual machines. Single sign-on. Single sign-on is a required component of vCenter Server. Single sign-on contains a central repository of vSphere administrative accounts, and the purpose is to provide centralized authentication so you don't have to log on to ESXi hosts one at a time. Without single sign-on, you have to log on to each ESXi host separately, a separate user account and a separate password on each one. But with single sign-on, you only log on once. In single sign-on, you, the network administrator, logs on to the single sign-on service. The single sign-on service can then authenticate you from its own internal database, or the authentication can be referred to another authentication source, such as Active Directory. After you are authenticated by Active Directory or by the single sign-on database, then you are issued an access token, and then that allows you to access any vCenter Server, any ESXi host, and any virtual machine. Single sign-on allows you to log on only once and allow you to access many hosts. The Platform Services Controller. The single sign-on service runs on the Platform Services Controller. The Platform Services Controller can be a separate computer, or it can run on the same computer as vCenter. vCenter Server is a virtual machine management application, and single sign-on is an authentication service. The main point with vCenter Server is that vCenter Server allows you to manage many ESXi hosts and many virtual machines from one location, and it provides single sign-on for a single logon. Now let's look at vCenter Server installation. There are a couple ways to go. You can assign vCenter Server on a separate physical server, or you can install it on a virtual machine. vCenter Server can be installed on a physical server. And if you look at this diagram, here is you, the network administrator, and here are all of our ESXi hosts with virtual machines running on them. The vCenter Server is a separate server that you log on to, and then it allows you to configure all of those ESXi hosts. In this example, you can clearly see it's in a separate box. But vCenter Server can also be installed on a virtual machine. vCenter Server can be installed on a virtual machine running on an ESXi host. What we're going to do is install vCenter Server on a Windows server which is running in a virtual machine which is running on an ESXi host. When we install vCenter Server on a Windows server on a virtual machine, we select the edition, and there are two editions. There's the vCenter Server Foundation, which is just good for a small installation with 3 hosts, or there is vCenter Server Standard for mid-sized and larger organizations. That's what we're going to select. To download vCenter Server from VMware, we go into www.vmware.com to downloads, and we select vSphere. And within vSphere, we see Download VMware vSphere version 6. We click on Product Downloads, and at the top, the first item we see is VMware ESXi. That is the installation disk that we already used to install the ESXi host. What we are interested in is the second item here, the VMware vCenter Server. So we download that, and you can see VMware vCenter Server for Windows, and there is the ISO. The vCenter Server appliance we will talk about later. Right now we're on vCenter Server for Windows. So I select Download Now. After I download it, after I download the ISO, I then burn it to a DVD, and now I have the vCenter Server installation DVD, and they call that the Vim Setup DVD. To install vCenter Server, we are going to install vCenter Server on a Windows server which is running on a VM. So there are 3 major steps to that. The first step would be to create a virtual machine on an ESXi host, and then install Windows Server and VMware tools in the virtual machine, and then we would install vCenter Server on the Windows server. What we would do is insert the DVD in the DVD drive, or we could install from ISO. Let's configure the virtual machine DVD to read from the ISO. And as you know, an ISO is a file which appears to a virtual machine as an installation DVD. So I select my Windows vCenter Server, right-click, select Edit Settings, and under CD DVD drive, it's currently mapped to the DVD drive which is in the ESXi host, the physical DVD drive. But if I select Data Store ISO file, I can then browse the data store, and in the data store I can locate the ISO for vCenter Server. So I will select that ISO, followed by OK and OK. So now vCenter Server has the ISO for vCenter Server. Then the next thing to do is to power on the vCenter Server. Then if we launch the virtual machine console, then we can see here is our vCenter Server, and it just recognized the DVD. So I will run the install program, and it says vCenter Server for Windows. vCenter Server is a Windows application that manages data center access control. So that's what we want, so we click on Install. Welcome to the VMware vCenter Server 6.00 installer. We click on Next. we accept the licensing agreement, and then we select Next. And then under deployment type, we can select embedded or external deployment. Embedded deployment is when the vCenter server is on the same virtual machine as the platform services controller, which has the single sign-on service, which is what you would typically use. Now, for a larger organization, you could have the vCenter server on its own separate virtual machine and the platform services controller on a separate virtual machine as well. But for our installation, which would be small to mid-size, we will select embedded deployment, and we click on Next. We then assign a name to this vCenter server, and I will just call it vCenter-server.ccbcmd.edu, and then click on Next. It says it cannot resolve the IPv6 address. We are not using IPv6. Then we create a new vCenter server single sign-on domain, and that domain will be called, by default, vSphere.local. The default administrator name is administrator. So we will assign a password, and then we will configure the password, and then click on Next. Then we can use the Windows local system account, which is the administrator account, which is the account we would typically use. We could use another account, but typically we would use the administrator account. We click on Next. Then we can use an embedded database, what they call a Postgres database, or if we had a large institution, we could use an external database. We click on Next. Then we see that it will use these ports, obviously port 80 and port 443, and these are ports that will be used by the management services, and the reason that they tell us these ports is so we can make sure to have these ports open on any firewalls that are between the vCenter web client and the vCenter server. We will click on Next, and then we can install vCenter server on the C drive, followed by Next. And then under the summary, we see we will be installing vCenterServer.ccbcmd.edu with an embedded platform services controller with single sign-on. Administrator name is administrator. Local domain is vSphere.local. We will click on Install, and then we can see as it installs, there is the VMware Directory Services for authentication. There is the VMware vCenter server. There goes the VMware vSphere Virtual Data Center. And then it's installing the VMware Inventory Service. Now it's installing the vSphere Web Client. And now it's doing profile-driven storage. It's installing the syslog collector. It's installing performance charts. And now the setup is complete. Your vCenter server is successfully installed. vCenter server for Windows successfully installed. So after vCenter server is installed, then we would connect to vCenter server. We could use the vSphere desktop client, or we could use the vSphere web client. Let's connect to the vCenter server using the vSphere desktop client because we have already used it previously. We go to our desktop and select the vSphere desktop client, and then we type in the IP address of the vCenter server, not the ESXi host. Then we type the administrator name, which is not root. The administrator is administrator at vSphere local. We type in the password, we click on log on, and now we are connected to vCenter server. And then at this point, we would create virtual machines, but we will cover that later on in this chapter in part 3. After vCenter server is installed, you can connect using the vSphere desktop client or the vSphere web client. We will look at the vSphere web client a little bit later. vCenter Server, in summary, vCenter Server allows you to manage many ESXi hosts and many virtual machines from one location using one administrator name and one password. vCenter Server can be installed on a separate physical server, or vCenter Server can be installed in a virtual machine. We can install vCenter Server on a Windows server, which is running on a virtual machine, which is running on an ESXi host. And this concludes part 1 of Module